Hello, everyone, and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow. We are so excited to start this new year off with even more conversations, and I am super excited to have Justinne join us again for this month's edition. Now, this month's edition, we're talking about classism. So, Justinne, could you do a quick overview or intro of what classism is as defined by S squared?
Yes, so here at A Squared, we define classism as prejudice or discrimination based on someone's socioeconomic status. So this involves unequal treatment, assumptions, and biases that privilege individuals or groups with higher socioeconomic status while marginalizing those with less. And classism manifests in policies, practices, and even cultural norms that perpetuate economic inequality and hinder social mobility. An article by the Economic Policy Institute states that children from low socioeconomic backgrounds start school at a disadvantage, lagging significantly in what they call school readiness. So, Megan, how does it manifest in different educational settings?
Wow, this is such a complicated question, Justin, right? What we used to call the achievement gap, we have recently, in the last, I would say probably 10 years or so, started to do deeper research and realize that it's not necessarily an achievement gap. Instead, it's an opportunity or resource gap. And people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds typically are in school systems that have lower funding sources because most of our funding, especially our local funding, comes from our property taxes. So if our property taxes are lower, then our school funding sources are lower, which is just this cycle, and it leads into systemic bias that we talk about. And what's very interesting is most of our children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds also tend to fit into certain other identity groups as well. But when we're talking about school readiness, there's so many factors to think about. So, school readiness, let's talk about it. Some children go into school knowing their alphabet already. Some children do not. Now, how do children learn their alphabet? Children learn their alphabet by having parents who read to them, who work with them, right? Or maybe not parents, maybe it's daycare providers, etc. But it's typically children who have an adult person with them on a regular basis. So if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, you're probably working a lot just to make ends meet, which means you don't have as much time to be able to work with your children, which is why, and again, it's this whole cycle, but it's why the government has put into place preschool and Head Start and different programs for children who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to be able to get into a school system before they start kindergarten at the age of 5. But this whole piece of school readiness is, do they know their alphabet? Do they know how to work with other children? Do they understand some
Mhm.
of those social skills? Because if you have a lack of social skills, you're not going to be welcomed into a group, which means you're going to have a horrible experience, which is going to impact your academic growth as well. So it's this cycle of pieces that we talk about. But I will say, being a former educator and still being an educator of sorts, but being from the K-12 setting and most of my career being in the elementary setting, when people talk about school readiness or the achievement gap, it just irritates I don't want to swear, but it irritates me because the only reason why we have some of these things is because of systemic issues that exist in our society. We have systemic classism in our society, whether you want to talk about redlining or anything else when we look at real estate. We have systemic racism in our society. We have systemic sexism in our society. We have systemic bias in our society that is impacting our children's ability to learn because they're not given access to the same resources that children from privileged identities are being given access to. Now, does that mean that people who are in higher socioeconomic areas didn't work hard? Absolutely not. I know many people who are in higher socioeconomic status who worked very hard to get to that point. And I give them all the props in the world to be able to get to that point. At the same time, I know people who work extremely hard, who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and continue to work extremely hard and are not able to get ahead. So we need to have those conversations. But when we're talking specifically about school readiness, we're talking specifically about schools, This manifests in every facet of the world. And here's another thing, and I know I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but with our new president in place, if he is successful in doing what he's talked about, which is eliminating the Department of Education, we will have significant classism within our school systems, even more than already. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, or even right now, Justin, if you want. But when we're talking about the Department of Education and its role, it impacts our school systems significantly with the financial resources that they have available to them.
Yeah, and I understand we've talked about this within our team pretty significantly, like how dismantling the Department of Education will impact student life and the education of our students. So, specifically in classism, how do you think that will manifest?
Yeah, so here's the thing. The Department of Education is who monitors all of our federal funding. So just to give a quick kind of tutorial on school funding sources. But schools have their local fund or their general fund, and that is typically through property taxes, local fund allowances, maybe millages on property tax, etc. So that is based on your local environment. So if you have homes that are more costly to live in, then their taxes are higher, which means you have a higher per pupil allowance because of the property tax. Now, sometimes it's subsidized by the state as well. The state gives a certain amount per student. But what kicks in at the federal level are all of our title funds. So we have Title I funds, we have Title II funds, we have Title IV funds, we have Title III funds. We have funds at the federal level that specifically target certain populations of students. Our Title I funds are for lower socioeconomic and it targets literacy and math, but it is specifically meant for local areas that do not have a higher per pupil allowance and it targets lower socioeconomic. It is one of the largest federal pools of money. If the federal Department of Education goes away, there is a possibility that all of the grant funding also will go away. Now, this is not a done deal. It does not mean it's absolutely going to happen. We don't know. All we know right now is that with dismantling or with kind of disintegrating the Department of Ed at the federal level, what has been discussed is giving the power back to the local states. Now, some states might choose to allocate their funding in a similar way of having title funds, but without the federal level of federal funding, that could impact specifically our lower socioeconomic students. Because again, our monies come from two different sources. Our general fund, which is based on the local environment. If you have apartments and a lot of apartments, townhomes, condos, etc., townhomes and condos still have property taxes. But if you have a lot of apartments or low income housing, you might not have the property taxes available to help fund the education system in the local area. So, with all of this, and again, good or bad, we just need to acknowledge what's about to happen and we need to be aware of it. And I think that's the number one thing is we need to know what it is that might be coming up. Not to fear, not to sit in worry and anxiety, but to acknowledge that the things that we do, the votes that we take, the actions we take at the polling places, what we choose to vote on, what we choose to spend our energy researching is important to us, especially our school systems.
Thank you, Megan, for discussing that. I think it's really important for us to understand what impact that would make. And uh, so, according to a Gallup poll conducted in April 2024, 54% of Americans identify as middle class, with 39% considering themselves middle class and 15% as upper middle class. So in contrast, 31% identify as working class and 12% as lower class, while only 2% consider themselves as upper class. So, knowing all this and what you just discussed with um, the Department of Education, property taxes, and all of that. So, I'm curious, how would you define class privilege?
Yeah, Justin, if I could, before we get into class privilege, I want to talk about those numbers really quickly. Because what was interesting about that is it was a Gallup poll of people identifying themselves as this.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because when people are asked to define their own socioeconomic background, they often say that they're lower socioeconomic status than they really are, right? So people will often say, because we're taught, especially in American society, but I think we're taught globally. I mean, we've worked with quite a few clients in other countries as well, other parts of the world, but we're taught that money is something that you don't talk about a lot. We're taught that
Mm-hmm.
money is something that you kind of have shame around, right? That it's evil, right? That money is part of greed. And it's interesting because they said that it was Americans that you asked, and only 2% consider themselves upper class. In comparison to who? Because Americans are some of the more rich people in the world. So if we're considering in comparison to other Americans, then maybe. But if we're comparing them to people across the world, then that's a very different number, right? And I think it's important to talk about that in comparison to. And often with us squared, we don't do a lot of comparison, but we do need to acknowledge that there are people who are in different situations and different environments. And when we first started looking at some of the research for this podcast and we looked at this data, this statistic really kind of hit me in a weird way because number one, it didn't specify in comparison to who, right? It didn't specify the demographics of who answered these questions because I'm curious, what were the demographics? Were they men? Were they women? Were they non-binary? What racial identity were they? What religious identity were they? Because all of that can play into how we see money and how we define our socioeconomic status. And I think that's a big play into intersectionality. Now, when we go back to your first question of class privilege, having class-based privilege is being able to pay your bills without having to look, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to do this? You know, growing up, I did not have a lot. And I remember my mom used to always say this phrase, we have to rob Peter to pay Paul. And I didn't understand what it meant, right? And as I got older, I realized that what she was doing is she was saying, okay, we're going to pay this bill this month, and then we're going to pay this bill next month, but not this one, because we couldn't do 2 months in a row of not paying one specific bill because then they might shut off our utilities. But we could do every other month and they wouldn't shut off our utilities, but we might have a late fee, right? But that's the kind of thing that you have to deal with when you don't have that. Now, in my environment now, my adult behaviors, I live a very frugal lifestyle. However, that also gives me some class-based privilege. And what I mean by that is I pay my bills. I don't have to look at my accounts to say, do I have the ability to pay this bill? No, I live within my means. If I wanted to live more extravagantly, like many of my friends, and people always tell me, but Megan, you are doing well. You deserve to do this. No, I would rather be able to pay my bills without having to worry if I'm going to be able to do that or not. So I'm okay not getting the nicest things. I'm okay not having name brand clothes or the nicest house or the nicest car. I'm okay with that because I know I can pay all my bills. But that's a decision I've made. I also know that because of my identity groups, I have had the opportunities to get into that position financially a little bit easier and without as many barriers as others who might have done the exact same things I've done, made the exact same decisions I've made, but because of societal identities have not been as successful as I've been. But class-based privilege is when people assume that you have the ability to pay bills or you have money or you have that. Maybe it's not even an assumption, it truly is that belief that you have the ability to pay bills. It's being able to get a loan. It's having good credit. This goes into another rabbit hole that I don't think we were expecting to talk about, but here in the US, credit scores. A child who is identified in certain identities has a higher credit score out the gate than someone from different identities. So you typically get a credit score around the age of 18, maybe 19. It depends on when you get your first credit card, your first bank account, etc. But there have been research, and I don't have it at my fingertips, but there's been research out there that people of different identities have a different starting credit score, which is a whole other piece. And your credit score defines what access you will have to resources, which ultimately defines what socioeconomic status you will be in the long run.
And that
So,
is interesting and a continuing theme that to a certain extent is sad to think about how much the trajectory of someone's life is defined by numbers like a credit
mhm.
score, a percentage, how much you get paid and what you have access to, you know. So
Yeah,
as they say, it's a numbers game.
yeah.
Are you ready to commit to your personal transformation? Take the next step with my book, Metamorphosis, From Savior to Changemaker. This engaging read dives into the foundational principles of social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, guiding you to explore your own transformation. Through reflective journal prompts and actionable steps, you'll uncover where you stand within the 7 stages of metamorphosis and how to drive meaningful change within your community and beyond. The journey isn't always linear, but every step builds toward a better tomorrow. Get your copy today at www.meganfucciarelli.com.
And, I know we've gone down a lot of rabbit holes, but I'm interested, Justin, in what assumptions you feel like we hold within education that perpetuate classist attitudes. Like, what do you see as some of those things that we hold on to in education, and how can we challenge some of those beliefs?
Yeah, so with that, we have another research that we have here for this episode, which is by the US Census Bureau, where individuals from the top family income quartile are 8 times more likely to obtain a bachelor's degree by the age of 24 compared to those from the lower income quartile. And this is such a stark contrast that highlights how classism shapes educational trajectories and, it perpetuates a cycle of poverty that often begins long before a student even reaches college. And a contributing factor is the assumptions that we hold within education, like how we often presume that all students have equal access to resources like technology, like the way an assignment is given is an assumption that all children have an immediate access to the internet or to a computer or even just a mobile phone or even stable housing, assuming that they have a proper home, like a conducive environment to go home to do homework and parental support, overlooking the systemic inequities that our students face. And these assumptions, coupled with judgments about students' potential or their behavior based on their socioeconomic background, can reinforce harmful stereotypes and lower expectations, further widening what we were talking about, the opportunity gap. And given these realities, it's crucial for us to examine the role of educators and administrators. So, on your end, how do educators and administrators either perpetuate or challenge classist structures within the school systems?
There's so many things, and it circles back to what we talked about earlier with potentially funding changing, funding sources changing. But what we can do within our school systems now is having access to resources and having access to resources that don't require a long application process to get them. So, what I mean by that is oftentimes people who have lower socioeconomic resources, they have a high sense of pride. And we talk about this a lot. We don't talk about class, we say socioeconomic, because I know people who are from very high socioeconomic standings who have very little class. Right. And I know people who are from low socioeconomic standings who have a very high level of class. So I don't use the word class anymore when we talk about socioeconomic status. But oftentimes, people who come from financial struggles are very proud of and very prideful people. They don't want to ask for handouts, right? It's about how can we support one another without it being a handout, right? We don't want to go into the savior mentality. And that goes into the whole thing we talked about with, our transformation of social justice. We don't want to get into the savior mentality where we're just giving people things to give them. But what we want to do is we want to give access to resources to empower people to continue to go further. And in our school systems, whether it's field trips, whether it's extracurricular activities. I know my son, he played sports this year, and the sports fee was a very large number. And I was thinking, like, oh my gosh, how are people paying this, especially if they have multiple children? And oh my gosh, right? And I think those are some of those pieces. Yes, there's an application available for people to apply, but there's that level of pride where people don't want to do that. And, some of the back and forth we get with that is, well, then people who don't necessarily need it are going to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing, it's the honor system. And I think as a
Yep.
society, are there going to be people who say, yes, give me the free sports entry that don't necessarily need it? Yes. But if they believe they need it, then what is the harm in doing that? Because just for as many people as there are who opt into receiving those extra resources, there are families who opt into supporting and paying above and beyond what their child needs. And again, it's not about saying that you're required to do that, but those are things we can do in the school system is reduce that barrier, reduce that application that's necessary. One of the best things that a lot of schools did, at least here in Michigan, quite a few schools have gone to free breakfast and lunch for all students. And what that is it used to be you had to apply for free and reduced lunch. But there were kids who didn't apply. Either their parents didn't feel comfortable applying, or they didn't think they qualified, even though they might have, or there were multiple reasons. So a lot of schools have gone over to free and reduced lunch for everybody. Now, does that mean that every single person gets a free and reduced lunch? No, it means it's accessible and available for people who want it. And it takes away the stigma for the children who do get it, because no one knows if they would actually qualify for it or not, because everyone gets free and reduced lunch. If you don't want it, then you pay for lunch, or you pay for extras, or you bring your own lunch. But it just kind of
Mm-hmm.
levels the field to say, hey, everyone has access to this. If you want it, great. If you don't, you don't. Now, that does also kind of tread on the equality versus equity, but it's, again, not everyone has to take it. It's not like they say, okay, everyone get in line and you get a lunch, and if you don't want it, you can throw it out. It's saying get in line if you need a lunch.
Yep.
And I think those are some of the things: access to extracurricular activities, access to lunch, access to different resources, field trips, etc. Eliminating the need for applications. Now, that's not something that school districts can do locally a lot of times, because it is a federal, especially right now with Title I funding and everything else, you need to have federal applications completed to earn or to receive the money from the federal government. If it goes to the state level, I'm sure the state is going to request that as much as well. But those are some initial things, just eliminating the barriers as much as possible. Um, Justin, let's switch over to curriculum. And I'm curious, I know we've talked a lot about this. We're working with some schools to help them rewrite their curriculum, but how do you envision the curriculum either reflecting or challenging some of those classist norms or those classist ideals that we've talked about?
Yeah. So right now, curriculum often reflect classist norms by centering the perspectives, histories, and experiences of dominant socioeconomic groups while marginalizing or even, to a certain extent, omitting those of lower income communities. And it may also perpetuate assumptions about, like we mentioned, access to resources such as requiring materials or technology that are not universally available. And to address this, educators can diversify the curriculum by incorporating voices and narratives from all backgrounds, emphasizing critical thinking about social and economic systems, and ensuring assignments are accessible and equitable for all students, regardless of their resources. I remember when I was in university, this is a struggle that some of my classmates faced, where there are immediate homeworks that had to be submitted within the day it was given, but the struggle was they didn't have access to a computer that will help them complete that assignment. And I think one of the things that can be done is, of course, we can't avoid the use of technology and the use of internet, but to be considerate about whether everyone has access to those resources. And beyond curriculum changes, schools can adopt a range of strategies to combat classism, promote a sense of belonging for all students. And I'm also curious to know, what are some effective approaches that schools can implement to create a more inclusive, supportive environment?
Yeah, I mean, going to what you just shared with technology, right? A lot of schools are implementing a one-to-one initiative, which allows children a device to take home with them or a device to use. But that brings in a whole other level of it's not just the device, sometimes it's internet as well.
Mm-hmm.
So some schools are starting to offer hotspots. They're taking children and giving hotspots to children to take home. So those are some of those pieces. Again, it's about access. That's the biggest thing that we can do within our school systems is make sure that there's access. If you don't have the opportunity to give one-to-one devices or hotspots, opening up your school building and making your school more of a community hub than just a school building, right? We
Mm-hmm.
talk about that a lot with some of our schools, especially when we're doing equity audits and asking them, what is the purpose of your school? Is the purpose of your school to educate your children, or is it also to support the families and to engage with families? And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but it's what is the purpose? And I think sometimes, especially with classism, if you're working in a school system where you have different elements of poverty, and when I speak to that, there's different elements, right? There's absolute poverty, which is people do not have money for food, clothing, a roof over their heads. It's absolute poverty. But you also have situational poverty, which here in Michigan, especially in the Metro Detroit area, we see quite a bit. And situational poverty is the auto industry laid off and you have no money coming in for a few months. That's situational poverty, right? Relative poverty or relational poverty is when you live in an area that is pretty wealthy, but your family is not very wealthy. You're in poverty compared to others in the area. You might not be in poverty compared to someone else from a different area, but compared to your friends, compared to others in that school system. So they might schedule a field trip and say, oh, it's only $1,000 to go on this spring break. And you're like, $1,000? Only $1,000? To many, $1,000 isn't that much, but to others, it's a lot, right? So I think some of those things are effective strategies that schools can think about is think about what you're putting out there and talk about the different types of poverty that you might be experiencing. And also really helping students realize, especially with the situational poverty or the relative poverty, I apologize, is relative poverty can cause significant social emotional damage. When you're the only child in the school who doesn't have name brand stuff, you don't have a true sense of belonging, right? When you're the only child who has never traveled because you don't have the money to do so, when you're the only child in high school who doesn't have a car, right? Those are all examples of how children can have that sense of belonging that's not 100% because relating to others or relative to other children in the classroom environment, they have much less. And I think it's important for schools to have those conversations. Now, I'm not advocating that schools purchase everyone a vehicle, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. But it's important to acknowledge what you have in your school system and what kind of environment you're in for your kids or for your students.
Yes, thank you, Megan. I think that's such an important conversation to have, especially like in the beginning of the year, not for anything, but New Year's resolutions and managing, not just uh for organizations, but for individuals as well, or like managing finances, how to make ends meet, and all that. So uh, I think talking about classism is such an impactful conversation to have, especially
Mhm.
at this time. But unfortunately, that's really all the time we have for today. So again, thank you so much for such a meaningful conversation again today.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And remember, anyone who's listening, make sure you follow us on social media, check out our newsletter. We've got lots of good things coming up. So great to have the conversation.